Hey everyone, this is Will from Charlotte, North Carolina, and welcome to this exciting and important episode of The Missing Piece. 1 month later, the world is still watching this ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Just recently, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky got interviewed by the US media. Throughout the entire interview, the message was very clear. It was crucial, and it is more important today for the nation learn to stand and defend itself, especially in front of the word humanitarian. But meanwhile, if you look around the situation, one urgent matter is drawing attention in a greater scale, and it's the issue of refugee crisis. Since the war, that we know millions of the Ukrainian citizens have left the country because what's happening in Ukraine right now. And however, for the countries who are welcoming these refugees, they're standing at the crossroads. On one hand, the leaders are embracing this new change, but domestically, for the domestic citizens, they're embracing this change with doubts and even greater fears. So that's why today in this episode, we are going to talk about some of the crucial issues, not just about the refugee crisis taking place because of the war in Ukraine and Russia, but for centuries, countries such as the United States have been addressing this issue, but so far, little progress have made. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our special guest today, and it's Shelley Culberton. And Shelley is an expert on forced displacement and Associate Director of the Disaster Research and Analysis Program at the Homeland Security Research Division of the nonprofit, nonpartisan RAND Corporation. Shelley, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Will.
Shelley, let's get started. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, I think I want to get to the question right away I find you because this amazing article that you wrote, regarding that the refugee and the refugee crisis, it's drawing attention or standing at the crossroads. But why is it so important for us to understand or for us to comprehend this refugee crisis at this moment, given the fact that the whole world is continuing focusing on the tension between Russia and Ukraine politically, not from this humanitarian perspective?
So, Will, at this point in time, about 1 in 4 Ukrainians has been displaced. That many people have had to flee their homes because of the violence. So not all have left the country. About 4.2 million Ukrainians have left the country, fleeing to elsewhere in Europe as of today. And another 6 or 7 million are displaced internally. But this is a massive number of people. I mean, can you imagine 25% of a whole country that has been displaced? So while there's a lot in the news about what's happening on the day-to-day, what's also important to consider is what could happen in the future. So history shows us in other refugee crises that most often they're not temporary. In fact, they can last for years or decades. And so the people who are being displaced today are likely going to be, or at least many of them, long-term displaced communities elsewhere in Europe. And indeed, RAND did a study that was published just a few months ago last year that found that on average, after a conflict ends, only about 30% of refugees will have returned to their country of origin 10 years after a conflict. So what that indicates is that it's pretty likely that a lot of the people fleeing today may be in other European countries for the long term.
Well, but Shelley, again, we are looking at the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine right now. And not too long ago, I talked to someone else and regarding this, of the word come up with, it's called identities. So in other words, we know that when they leave their country because the political or any social or economic reasons that they move to a new place, their sorts of identity are also changed as well. So from your perspective, how do we know that when those refugees arrive to the new place, they are going to be well fit into the new society instead of becoming a problem? Given this condition, especially after the pandemic, no country is certain that the direction that it's going. But on top of that, if we have newcomers or if I've come in these people from those war-torn nations, it's going to add a lot more burden and pressure on them. So how do we understand this identity from this domestic issue and also from this international scale?
So I think your question of identity, Will, really gets to the issue, as you put it, of integration. So once refugees flee and they end up going to a new country, how is it that they're integrated or welcomed into societies? And there's a mix of experience globally with that very issue. In some cases, have a long history of absorbing new people. So in the United States, we pride ourselves on the idea that we're a nation of immigrants. So there's a long heritage of doing that. Some countries also pride themselves on helping helping people with humanitarian needs. In other cases, refugees can be welcomed if they've got a similar cultural background as the host communities. So there are a lot of cases in which refugee populations can find a pretty strong welcome. And I think so far that's what we've seen with this refugee crisis, where Ukrainians are getting a pretty strong welcome. At the same time, there are a lot of risks with getting a really large surge of new people that need to be absorbed. They go beyond a question of identity, but go to actual burdens on host communities. So, for example, if you take Eastern Poland right now, where they've absorbed over half of the refugees. They've got 2.4 million people. Imagine you're a community and you suddenly get a deluge of people. You have to find housing for them. Waits at hospitals can become very long. Housing shortages, crowded classrooms. So there can be very real strains on host communities that can lead to a lot of resentment of new populations. So that's something that has to be actively managed. That is not so much of an identity question, but is what are burdens on host communities, and how can even welcoming host communities, and how can those challenges for host communities be managed?
Well, Shelley, it's so interesting that we know today, given any condition, that no country is supposed to be involved in any wars, especially, again, post the pandemic period. I mean, this pandemic, the COVID-19, completely shocked the world, and every single country, especially the countries in Europe, it's shifting its gear, economically speaking. But meanwhile, let's just say, take Poland, for example. If the nation decides, the nation has already decided to take the refugees come into the country, but that could indirectly become this political rival with the country as Russia. So in other words, because when we are dealing with country as Russia, dealing with leader as Vladimir Putin, he doesn't see such action as this generosity or as a humanitarian project, and misunderstandably, he could interpret as a political rival. So in other words, don't you think that these countries are creating this political trouble for themselves by welcoming these refugees or by welcoming these people? Why can't this country just leave it alone? Because these people eventually will take care of themselves. But why bother to step in despite of this political differences? I
think many countries that find fleeing people and their neighbors have historically opened up their borders because there's something about human nature to want to help. There are also international treaties about accepting refugees, in particular the 1951 Refugee Convention, about the right for people to seek sanctuary and asylum in another country. And so in many cases, once people flee, neighbors will open their doors to them. They do face challenges down the road, however. So let's say, comparing with the Middle East, for example, the civil war in Syria, about 6.5 million Syrians have fled as refugees. And for the most part, neighboring countries kept their borders open to help them. And then sometimes the borders have been tightened and so forth, but by and large, those 6.5 million people were given sanctuary somewhere. It has led to political challenges down the line, as you've mentioned. Perhaps less with the government of origin. So perhaps the risk is less with angering Russia about taking the refugees, but more about internal politics. So if you go back to the idea of host communities becoming burdened, what we've seen in multiple refugee situations is that there can be a political backlash with large refugee surges if those circumstances are not managed in ways that help the host community. So, for example, in the 2015 migration crisis in the EU, where over a period of several years focused on 2015, there were about 4 million people who crossed EU borders from either the Middle East or sub-Saharan Africa. They were called irregular migrants. In other words, they arrived without proper visa procedures in advance. That eventually led to a pretty strong political backlash and led to support for some far-right parties because of that. So a lot of internal political challenges. Similarly with the Middle East, so for example, Syrian refugees who initially fled and were welcomed by host communities. But there's been a fair amount of tension about what will happen with these people long term, in particular since they've been there for 10 years. I do think that in most countries where refugees have fled, while there can be political tensions and a lot of rhetoric in the news, most for the most part have stayed stable. So I don't think that this is something that's going to be an issue of security for the EU in terms of taking Ukrainian refugees.
Shelley, I want to read something that you wrote in the article, and I quote, "Host communities worry that their jobs will be taken by desperate newcomers who will work for less. And sometimes locals resent the refugees for receiving aid even as they themselves live in poverty." Shelley, can you help us to understand what you're trying to say behind the sentence? Because we know that, again, perhaps that we can't really use the pandemic as one excuse, but granted, that the economy or the domestic economic development has always been the center for every single country. Since right now we're in this competitive age, every single country, especially, from the upper class, the middle, and lower, no one would like to be fallen behind, and everyone would like to get the same steak, in the same restaurant. But however, in reality, that's not the case. But right now that you have those refugees and you have those immigrants coming to the country and they're willing to work for less and they're willing to, to go through these hardships and just because they're looking for stability. But meanwhile, the locals are already suffering in poverty. How does that work in the long run? So in other words, how does that even fare to the people in local, by the way?
So in many cases, local communities have a lot of fears that a new surge of other people arriving will take jobs, for instance. We did a study on narratives about migration, that also last year, and that's a very common narrative and a common fear that when a lot of new people arrive, there's going to be competition for jobs, and locals may not fare very well. In many cases, though, what we do find is that a surge of new people can actually create demand and improve employment for local host communities, despite some of those fears. So we've seen that in some parts of the Middle East and so forth. But again, the flows of people need to be managed in such a way that it's not overburdening to tremendous extent on certain communities, but can be, in some cases, spread out. And I think in the Ukraine situation, there's an opportunity to view the arrival of these new people in a couple ways. First, helping them because of their humanitarian need, but it's also an opportunity. So there are parts of the EU that have labor market shortages. Not all parts. Some parts of the EU have high unemployment, but there are parts in particular in Eastern Europe. Germany has a labor market shortage. Spain has a labor market shortage for construction workers. There are ways of thinking of these populations as both as people in humanitarian need, but also people who are able to contribute to the economy and really add to the places where they go to. So, but all that depends on the situation being managed in a way that feels orderly and not threatening for host communities.
Shelley, it's so interesting that, again, we're going back to the circle from this economic perspective. But the next question, let's bring something more tangible. National security has always been the center issue, for every single country, since today that, I don't want to say, terrorists everywhere. This is such could be a misleading sentence, but in reality, we know some of the nations from the European side, they have encountered, terrorists over the decades. And again, given this condition that who's coming in and who's going out, and it's rather difficult to calculate at this moment. But given that condition that some people, again, I think this is something that we discussed before, that might not be able to fit into the new environment easily. And then that could create such psychological backlash, or that could create a lot more discomfort. And then because those circumstances and because the limitation to the new place, these people or anyone could easily have this internal resentment or, internal dissatisfaction towards the country. And that could actually interrupt or disrupt the order of the society. And from your perspective, should the countries be worried about that? So in other words, these people, they're not okay with it. But meanwhile, because they cannot go back to their original country, so what do we do about them?
So in the study that I mentioned about narratives about migration, the question you're raising is actually the foundation of a pretty common narrative that refugees or migrants in general could bring additional crime or lead to terrorism and so forth. And what we've found on that is that actually in many places immigrants and refugees have lower crime rates than citizens do. In the United States, immigrants have lower crime rates than American citizens. In Colombia, which has taken about 1.7 million Venezuelans, what they found is that the Venezuelans who have arrived have lower rates of violent crime, although they do have higher rates of petty crime. Lots of poor, desperate people have entered. So the picture is pretty mixed there. But for the most part, despite many of the fears, the migrants are not generally responsible for large rates of crime or additional insecurity. That's not to say that it can't happen. So some other colleagues of mine did a study on security and refugees. And what they found is that, yes, there have been times where terrorists have come among surges of refugees and where the presence of large numbers of refugees have led to civil war or radicalization and backlash and so forth. So it's not, it does happen. What they also found, though, was that those cases where refugee populations have been associated with increased violence or crime were often when those communities felt very marginalized. So didn't have adequate job opportunities or educational opportunities, were confined to camps, etc. So how they're treated, managed is how they're treated is important, and it's important to manage. And I think this similarly relates to the discussion about host communities and jobs that we were just discussing. That finding ways to integrate people with win-win solutions where they have access to jobs, they feel they've got opportunities, but in ways that aren't threatening and feel manageable to host communities. It's really important to manage that process on both sides for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Shelley, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, I know you spend a lot more times in the Middle East, and you're very experienced, dealing with refugee crisis, from the many countries in the Middle East. Can you help us today to understand, for example, we talk about the country of Syria and we talk about the country, Afghanistan or Iraq, these are the countries that today are still facing this political changes or are still undergoing a tremendous war impact. Now, coming back to the issue of refugee crisis, how would you describe today that in terms of understanding the refugee crisis issue related to Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq, all these countries? Can you share with us a little bit?
Yeah, I would put it around one concept, that these are long-term issues, but they're being treated as short-term issues, and that's a problem for everyone. So about 60% of all of Syria's population has been displaced by war, which I just find incredible, that 60% of the whole country. About half of those are internal, half of those have fled as refugees. it is like the Syrian civil war is now 11 years from when it started. Many of those people are not going home, and yet the circumstances in which they live in host communities implies still that those are supposed to be temporary. They often lack work permits. They struggle to integrate into education. Globally, about half of refugee kids are out of school. And so they're, in many cases, treated as kind of a marginalized community that's not allowed to fully integrate into the societies where they are. At the same time, the societies that have hosted them have been remarkably generous and face a lot of challenges doing that absorbing, but perhaps could use a little bit more assistance to make that happen. I think if I were going to leave people with one thought about refugee situations and managing them, is that the system that we have globally for managing refugee situations is broken. It's often premised on the idea that if you just help people temporarily while they really need support, keeping them in camps or in restricted environments, then when the conflict's over, they can just go home and resume their normal lives. And we found that doesn't really happen. And so by keeping people in these sort of temporary states of limbo, without allowing them to integrate into new places and resume new lives, we're doing them a disservice, and we're doing the host communities and host countries a disservice. So I think the thought that I would leave people with is that we need a new way of managing refugee situations so people don't get caught in this limbo that can last for decades or generations.
We know that America has been the role models on democracy, and certainly that a lot more people, when they migrated legally, or when they came to the country as refugees, they suddenly expose this idea of capitalism, so understand how important it is to appreciate the word democracy in America. And again, Shally, as something that you touch on, they have been educated in America, or they receive this packaged education in the States. But meanwhile, we know that these ideas could incite their own thoughts easily. So in other words, they've tasted the sweetness of democracy, and they enjoyed the pleasure of living in America. But meanwhile, one day they are going to go home, they're going to go back to their own country to start to create this idea of democracy, or start to pursue this idea of democracy. But eventually, for the original country, these people could be seen as criminals, or these people could be seen as dissidents. Now, do you think that this is still an idea that we are giving education, we're offering these people this fresh idea or this democracy concept, and so that they are able to use them as a tool to revolutionize their home country? What is your take on that?
I think that hosting migrants in general is beneficial for a lot of societies, for an exchange of ideas. So I think the exchange of ideas goes a couple different ways. So, immigrants who come to the United States, whether as refugees or economic migrants or students, et cetera, absorb ideas in the United States. They also bring ideas from their own country that really enrich the United States from having that exchange. And I think, similarly, as the refugees who come to the United States or go to Europe, most of them probably will live there forever and just not go home. And they've brought that richness of their culture and heritage that are contributing to those new societies. Some will go home, but at that point, if they do go home, they're going back with skills that can really benefit a lot of their benefit their host country. So, for example, one area that I've worked in a lot is the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and there were some pretty big surges of Kurdish refugees who had been persecuted by Saddam Hussein in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And many went to Europe, got European educations, and then felt they wanted to come back and contribute to the redevelopment of Iraq, and in particular the Kurdistan region, once the conflict was over. And they brought tremendous experience, leadership capability, the ability to communicate with the West, translation, etc. Sometimes they struggled as well, but I think that this exchange of ideas among people in general just is benefit for both the source countries and the receiving countries.
Shelley, I want to end our conversation with last question. Again, going back to what we discussed at the beginning, the war between Russia and Ukraine right now does not seem to end very soon. And again, people are continuing leaving this country and Ukraine, and they're seeking hopes, and they're seeking better solutions, and hopefully that their lives will be restored one way or another. Let's talk about the attitude from the U.S. government. So my last question to you, Shelley, is how would you rate, or how would you critique or comment on the United States government today in terms of dealing with a refugee crisis from Ukraine today? How would you appreciate, or again, what's your thoughts on that one?
I think that the refugee crisis in Ukraine is still very early, and it's too early to say how well it's been handled. I do think that there are a number of decisions that have been made that hopefully will enable just the world in general to avoid the pitfalls of some of these other refugee crises. So first and foremost, the EU has given Ukrainians temporary protection status for at least 1 year, maybe up to 3, which gives them the right to work. They can enter without a visa, etc. That's a really big deal. That doesn't happen in very many other refugee situations. Colombia has done that with the Venezuelans. So I think just that is really huge. And then how this plays out. So handling the temporary situation, I think the world is very good at handling temporary situations. People flee, you help them with healthcare, get them a place to live. The U.S. has provided a tremendous amount of financial support, some logistics support, and so forth through funding UN agencies and so forth. So I think the world is very good at that. Where the risk is what happens next, and that's where I think there needs to be some planning that takes into account some of the worst things that can happen with that have happened historically and with other refugee situations, and make sure that the Ukrainians can avoid that. So here's where I think the U.S. can have a really strong leadership role. I mean, granted that the bulk of the responsibilities with Europe, because that's where the refugees are, but helping refugee kids get into school, helping the refugees spread out across Europe so they're not overburdening any particular community, maybe leading private sector companies or associations, large employers to come together and note, hey, we've got jobs over here, and then help Ukrainians find opportunities. So I think the real questions are what happens in the future, and how can the U.S., the EU, UN agencies, and the Ukrainians themselves, work to avoid some of the problems that we've seen in so many other circumstances.
Well, Shelley Culbertson is an expert on forced displacement and Associate Director of the Disaster Research and Analysis Program at the Homeland Security Research Division of the nonprofit Nonpartisan Rent Corporation. Shelley, thank you so much for taking your time to join our show. It's been a pleasure of talking to you, and we would love to have you back on the show again in the future regarding the refugee crisis within the international community.